You're not afraid of weakness. You're afraid of the strength you've never allowed yourself to release. Imagine for a moment, every morning you wake up and put on invisible armor. It's heavy, dozens of pounds of metal on your shoulders, chest, and back. You're so used to it that you no longer notice this weight, but it's there. And when you come home, when you close the bathroom door, you don't take it off. You can't. Your fingers don't remember how to unfasten these clasps. Male loneliness isn't the absence of people around you. It's the presence of armor that no one sees. And today we're talking about invisible armor, about the emptiness hidden underneath, and about finding the courage to take it off, even if just for a moment. James is 42, impeccable business suit, confident stride, firm gaze. He's the one who keeps everything under control, a department director at a tech company, father of 2, a husband who never forgets anniversaries and birthdays. How are you, James? Everything's great, working on a new project. This is his standard answer, as automatic as a handshake, as empty as his gaze when he sits alone in his car before going home. Erik Erikson, a prominent psychoanalyst, called this a midlife crisis. But it's not just a crisis. It's a slow collapse when a person suddenly realizes that the walls they built for protection have become a prison. James does everything right. He wakes up at 5:30, runs 5 kilometers, takes a contrast shower. He doesn't complain when a project requires working until midnight. He kisses his wife before bed, even when they haven't really talked for 2 weeks. But lately, he's noticed something strange, silence in his head. Not the creative silence that meditative practices talk about, but an oppressive emptiness, as if someone turned off the sound in a movie, but the frames continue to change. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of what has never been said, wrote philosopher Albert Camus. And so much has accumulated unsaid in James's head that it has turned into white noise. We live in a paradoxical world. On one hand, culture seemingly supports emotional openness and vulnerability. On the other, the economic system, corporate culture, and social expectations continue to demand men be unwavering. Psychologist Brené Brown spent years researching vulnerability and found that for most men, vulnerability is associated with weakness. And weakness is something that cannot be shown. Think about it. When was the last time you saw a successful man cry in public? Not from joy, not from sporting triumph, but from confusion, fear, or despair. Now think. How many times have you held back tears telling yourself, now is not the time, this is not the place? For James, not the time and not the place always exist. At work, he must be a leader. At home, he must be the foundation. With friends, he must be fun and carefree, alone with himself. But is he ever truly alone with himself? Remember that moment from The Matrix, when Neo suddenly realizes that the world around him is a system of rules and codes? For many men, this realization comes somewhere after 35-40 years. The system we exist in has a clear set of expectations. Be productive. Solve problems. Don't show weakness. Be responsible for everything. Be self-sufficient. And here's the paradox. You can fully meet all these expectations and still feel completely empty inside. One evening, James sits in the backyard of his house. The children are already asleep. His wife is watching a series, and he's just sitting and looking into the darkness. And suddenly, he remembers. In college, he wanted to be a writer. He wrote short stories and even received a few compliments from his literature professor. But then came the sensible advice. Find a normal job first. You can write any time. 20 years later, he hasn't written a single line. And he also remembers how he once could talk for hours with a friend about everything in the world. When did it stop? When did conversations turn into brief messages about work, sports, politics? Psychologist Carl Jung called this phenomenon a persona, a social mask we wear to meet society's expectations. The problem arises when a person begins to identify with this mask and forgets who they really are. Male armor forms over years. Boys don't cry, the first layer. Be a man, the second layer. You have to provide for your family, the third layer. Don't show that you're hurting, the fourth layer. Layer by layer, day by day. And there comes a moment when you no longer feel anything under this armor. Sociologist Thomas Sheff described this phenomenon as normative alienation from emotions. Simply put, men don't just hide emotions, they stop recognizing them. Ask yourself, when was the last time you could accurately say what you feel? Not normal, not good, not everything's under control, but truly name the emotion: confusion, fear, hope, joy, disappointment. For James, the moment of truth came unexpectedly. Thursday, an ordinary workday. A presentation of the project his team had been working on for 6 months. He stands before management, shows slides, speaks confidently and clearly, and then someone asks a simple question. James, why did you decide to take this particular approach? And suddenly, emptiness. He doesn't remember. He did what was expected of him, what he always does. But why exactly that way? What does he really think about this project? The silence stretches for 3 seconds, but it feels like an eternity. He answers something, professionally, smoothly. The meeting continues. But something inside him has broken. He comes home and suddenly can't remember how the second half of the day went. He sits in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes, just staring ahead. Anthropologist Ernest Becker wrote about the concept of the heroic project, the idea that people create ambitious goals and achievements as a way to cope with the awareness of their own mortality. But what happens when the heroic project suddenly loses meaning? That's when what philosopher Martin Heidegger called an encounter with nothingness occurs, a moment when the familiar structures that gave life meaning suddenly collapse. For James, this feeling is like falling from a height, and the scariest part, he can't tell anyone about it. What James is experiencing isn't unique. It's part of a broader phenomenon that some researchers call a crisis of male identity in the modern world. Statistics speak for themselves. Men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women. They're less likely to seek psychological help. They more often suffer from unnoticed depression, which masquerades as just fatigue or finds an outlet in addictions. Psychologist Terry Real, who specializes in male psychology, calls this phenomenon hidden depression, a condition where a person functions normally on the outside but feels emptiness inside. Recognize any of these symptoms? Irritability and intolerance for small things, loss of interest in things that used to bring pleasure, excessive immersion in work as a means of escape, sleep disturbances, either insomnia or constant drowsiness, unmotivated fatigue that doesn't go away after rest, difficulty concentrating, constant feeling of inner emptiness. The problem is that traditional male socialization doesn't provide tools for working with these feelings. Instead, it offers old proven methods. Work harder, grit your teeth, hold on. And here's the paradox. Men are often lonely precisely because they can't show their loneliness. Philosopher Karl Jaspers called this a boundary situation, a moment when a person finds themselves at the limit of their capabilities and is forced to rethink their entire life. For James, the turning point comes unexpectedly. Saturday morning. His 9-year-old son is working on a school project. He has to make a model of the solar system. James sits nearby, helping, and suddenly his son asks, "Dad, why are you always so serious?" A simple child's question hits right to the heart. "I'm not always serious," James automatically replies. "Yes, always," insists his son, "even when you smile." And suddenly, James realizes his son sees what adults don't see, sees the armor he never takes off. "You know," says James after a pause that seems like an eternity to him, "sometimes things are hard for adults." "What exactly is hard?" asks his son, coloring Jupiter in shades of red and brown. "Everything," answers James. And he's surprised by his own answer. Psychologist James Hillman talked about the voice of the soul, a quiet inner voice that often becomes inaudible under the pressure of social expectations and daily concerns. This voice can manifest in the most unexpected moments, through a chance encounter, a dream, or, as in James's case, through a child's question. You know, I wanted to be a writer when I was younger, James says unexpectedly to himself. Cool, his son replies. What did you want to write about? And James suddenly realizes he can't answer. He has disallowed himself from dreaming for so long that the dream has become invisible even to himself. What is true strength? Is it the ability to keep everything under control? Or perhaps the courage to admit that not everything can be controlled? Psychologist Brené Brown, after years of studying vulnerability, came to a paradoxical conclusion. True strength lies in the ability to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is our most accurate measure of courage, she writes. But for many men, this concept seems foreign, almost impossible. How do you show vulnerability in a world that constantly tests you for strength? James starts small. After talking with his son, he decides to do something he hasn't done in years. He buys a notebook and begins to write. Not a novel, not a story, just thoughts that come to mind. At first, the words don't flow. His fingers unusually hold a pen for something other than signing documents, but gradually the flow becomes freer. He writes about his fears, about the feeling that time is passing and he's only imitating life, about regret for unrealized dreams, about love for his children, which he often can't express. Therapist Terry Real, in his work with men, uses the concept of relational life. The idea that true health comes through deep, authentic connections with others. But to create such connections, you first need to restore the connection with yourself. For James, writing becomes the first step towards such restoration. And then something unexpected happens. One evening, his wife finds his notebook. I didn't want to intrude, she says. But I saw a few lines. James, I didn't know you felt all this. He prepares for judgment, for disappointment, but instead she says, I often feel lonely too, even next to you. And this becomes the beginning of the longest conversation they've had in years. Psychologist Carl Rogers believed that a central aspect of mental health is a person's ability to be authentic, to live according to their own internal values and needs, not external expectations. But the path to authenticity is rarely straight, especially for those who have spent years forming their identity around roles they must fulfill. For James, this journey begins with small steps. He allows himself to take a vacation for the first time in 3 years, not to go on an active journey, but simply to be at home with his family. He begins seeing a psychotherapist, initially with enormous skepticism, but gradually opening up. He finds the courage to say no at work to a project that requires a 6-day work week for 3 months. He creates a ritual of time for himself, just an hour a week, but this time completely belongs to him. And the hardest, he begins to tell the truth when asked, "How are you?" Philosopher Martin Buber wrote about the concept of I-thou relationships, genuine dialogue that occurs when two people meet as whole beings, without masks and roles. Such moments are rare, but they are what fill life with meaning. James begins to understand. True strength lies not in the ability to control everything, but in the courage to be authentic. A year and a half has passed since the day James's son asked him why he was so serious. Much has changed. Some things, externally, James transferred to another position in the company with less responsibility but more creative freedom. He began writing, not with the aim of becoming a professional writer, but simply because it brings him joy. But the most important changes occurred inside. The silence in his head is no longer oppressive. Sometimes it's filled with peace, sometimes with ideas and thoughts, sometimes just with presence. Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." But he also believed that the most important things in life cannot be expressed in words, they can only be shown. James finds a new way of communicating with his son, not through teaching and rules, but through shared moments of silence, observing the stars together, working in the garden, just sitting side by side. His relationship with his wife transforms. They still have difficult moments, but now they have a language to discuss them. And most importantly, James begins to feel authentic, not perfect, not as he imagined himself before, but real. Psychologist Irvin Yalom writes about the concept of existential isolation, the fundamental loneliness inherent in human existence. It cannot be completely overcome. But one can learn to live with it not through denial, but through acceptance. James still wears armor, sometimes it's necessary in this world, but now he knows how to take it off, and most importantly, he knows who he is without it. Male loneliness is not just an individual problem, it's a symptom of broader cultural dynamics that define how men should feel, act, and live. Psychologist and philosopher Erich Fromm believed that true human existence is possible only through being, not through having, through authentic presence in the world, not through accumulation of status, power, or material goods. For many men, the path to such being begins with recognizing the silence in the head, not as an enemy to be overcome, but as a sign pointing to a deeper need, the need for genuine connection. Where can you start? Recognize the armor. Become aware of what defensive mechanisms you use in different situations. When is your severity genuine, and when is it a mask? Find space for silence, not for emptiness or escape, but for true presence with yourself. This could be meditation, walking, creativity, anything that allows you to meet your authentic self. Start small. You don't need to radically change your life. Small steps are enough. Tell a close person about your true feelings. Allow yourself rest. Find a hobby that brings joy. Find an interlocutor. This could be a friend, therapist, support group, anyone who can listen without judgment. Rethink the concept of strength. True strength is not the absence of weakness, but the ability to be vulnerable and whole. Philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "Be yourself, and if you don't know who you are, know yourself." For men in the modern world, this process of self-knowledge often begins with acknowledging the silence in the head, not as an enemy, but as an invitation to a deeper, more authentic life. Are there moments in your life when you feel like you're playing a role rather than truly living? Write in the comments what you've never allowed yourself and what held you back. Perhaps it's time to start listening to the silence in your head and hear what it really wants to tell you.